Okay, welcome to our Tuesday night Torah class. Let's see here. Let me open in a word of prayer. Father God, thank you for the evening. Thank you for this group of people that came out tonight to look at your Torah. And I'd ask that you just be in our discussion tonight, that we would walk away with a little better understanding of you and your word, that we would feel closer to you and we'd understand how much you love us. I'd ask that you'd help us to gain the appreciation for your word that we really should have. And I just thank you that that there are people that really desire to know you. I appreciate the fact that you bless us for diligently seeking you. In Yeshua's name, amen. So tonight's kind of a milestone. We begin the 5th book of the Torah, which is, most people know, is Deuteronomy. So I probably said all this before, but I think I'll say it again. Do you know what Deuteronomy means? Who knows what Deuteronomy means? Yeah, Mike. Okay. It means second law. Nomi is the Greek word for law, like astronomy and economy and Deuteronomy. So and deutero is a prefix that means second. So Deuteronomy means second law. It's not really the second law, it's really the second iteration of the law. Okay. So what's the Hebrew word for the book of Deuteronomy? Mike? Devarim. Devarim is the Hebrew, it's plural. The singular is devar, and devar means word. So Devarim is words, and it comes from the very first verse. The names that have given to the books in the Torah, and even the Torah portions, all come from a word that's in the very first sentence of each portion or each book. And the first verse 1:1 of Deuteronomy says, these are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel. So that's why it's called Devarim. And the words, on the one hand, it's not terribly descriptive. So just for the fun of it, since we're kind of waiting for others to show up anyway, what's the Hebrew word for the first book of the Torah? Anybody know that? Bereshit. Bereshit. Now, Reshit means beginning. And when you put a B in front of it, Hebrew has a bunch of this stuff. You put a letter in front of a word or at the end of the word, and it adds a kind of like what are those things called? Prepositions. So based on the first word in Genesis, what do you suppose Bereshit translates into? In the. So the B means in the, and Reshit means beginning. So it's in the beginning. That's Bereshit. What's the second one? The second book of now we know the second book of the Torah, of course, is Exodus. We call it Exodus because it means, right, in Greek it means leaving. But do you know what it is in Hebrew? What the Hebrew word is? Shemot. Shemot is names. Names. It's names. And the reason is, if you read the first line of the first chapter of Exodus, it says, these are the names. And it goes on about names of the people that left Israel and went to Egypt. So the one in the middle book of the Torah, Leviticus, do you know what the Hebrew word is for that? Vayikra. Vayikra. I forgot what Vayikra means, but I can go find out real quick by just looking at the first. Means what? And he called. That's right. That's what it means. And he called. And it comes from the fact that Leviticus 1:1 says, Yahweh called to Moses and spoke to him. So Leviticus starts, and he called. And then Numbers. Did we remember what the book of Numbers means? Or what it is in Hebrew? What's the book of Numbers in Hebrew? Bamidbar. Bamidbar. So based on what we learned about Reshit and what Bereshit means, what do you suppose Bamidbar means? You may not know what Midbar is, but you know it means in the. So it's in the Midbar, right? Bamidbar, and Midbar means wilderness or desert. So Bamidbar means in the wilderness or in the desert. Just thought you'd like to know that. So now we're in Devarim. Have you noticed, I'm just going to blab for a couple minutes. Each of the books is very different. They're not similar. The book of Genesis, the most unique characteristic of the book of Genesis, if you ask me, is the fact that it was not written by anybody that was alive when the Torah was written. So all the stuff that's in the book of Genesis, Moses wrote. Moses is credited with writing all 5 of the books, right? So he wrote all that. Where do you suppose he got the information from to write all that? The obvious answer is from God, but it was handed down, right? It was handed down. It's what Abraham did with Isaac, and what Isaac did with Jacob, and what Jacob did with Moses or Joseph. He handed it all down. So those were the stories that were handed down. Joe has a question. Wait. Okay.
Even though these are all different, but yet they are a smooth flow through that. There's no interruption, but it's a beginning from Genesis 1 all the way through the Torah. It's a continuous flow of what's going on.
Well, that's true. That's true. And certainly it is. The books are much different. One of the things that I've always been amazed at, the book of Leviticus for me has always been the hardest. It took me a long time to grow to understand and appreciate that. And even now, there's tons about it I don't get. But the thing about the book of Leviticus is there's almost no action. Leviticus is tons and tons of stuff, tons of material, but very little action. Whereas the book of Numbers is almost all action. So just interesting. So, okay, enough said here. I guess anything now that we're through with the book of Numbers, where what would we be? 80% finished with the Torah. We're in the last of the books of the Torah. Does anybody have any comments they'd like to make about you made the one about it's all seamless kind of a thing. Does anybody else have any thoughts about the Torah? I'm not surprised, but that's okay. I'm sure you have some, you're just not thinking about them right now. So one of the things that we did before, I think is kind of valuable. You guys can tell me well how to do it, but there's this website called The Bible Project. The Bible Project is done by this, I don't know how many people's involved. Typically, it gives you the impression there's 2 or 3 people, but there's probably more than that. And they put together these neat little presentations about the Bible, about all kinds of different things in the Bible. And they've got some particularly good ones, I think, about the Torah. They've summarized each of the books. And we've watched the one. I know we watched the one for Leviticus, and we watched the one for Numbers. And so one of the things I thought we'd do since we're starting Deuteronomy is watch the one for Deuteronomy. Yeah, so if you want to switch over to that, we'll play that, and you can watch that. It goes kind of fast, so you got to pay attention. That's good. Everybody's awake. So go ahead if you want to play that. I think where you need to be, you just need to start it with the little arrow down in the lower left. There you go. Oh, guess not. Start it, then you make it big. I get it.
The book of Deuteronomy
Turn
is
it
the
up a
fifth
little,
book
okay?
of the Bible and the commandments. And then the centerpiece of this section is a famous line called the Shema. Moses says, "Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might." This became a very important daily prayer in Judaism, and it brings all of the themes of the book together. So the word listen, or Shema in Hebrew, it means much more than just to hear. Its meaning includes responding to what you hear, or in English we would say obey. And the word love in Hebrew also means much more than just an emotion or feeling. It's about a decision of wholehearted devotion to God that involves your will and your emotions, your mind and your heart. Now, for Israel, their obedience and devotion to God served a much larger purpose. Obedience to the laws is going to make Israel a unique people among the nations. Just like God said at Mount Sinai, they will become a kingdom of priests. And Moses now says how. Israel has the chance, by following the laws, to show the whole world the wisdom and the justice of God. The other key idea in the Shema is that Israel was called to obey and be devoted to the Lord alone. Or literally, in Hebrew, it says, the Lord is one. Now, in context, the point is that the Lord is the one God Israel is to worship and obey. Israel's about to go into the land of Canaan, where people worship idol gods that represent all different aspects of creation, the sun, the weather, sex, and war. And in Moses' view, worshiping these gods degrades humans and destroys communities. But worshiping the God of Israel, who's the creator and the redeemer, that will lead to life and blessing. And so we come to the large collection of laws at the center of the book. And they're roughly arranged by topic. So the opening section is about Israel's worship of their God. They were to have one central temple where one God would be worshipped. And also, God was to be worshipped in Israel's care for its poor. So, for example, all Israelites were to set aside 1/10 of their annual income to be given to the temple. But another 10th was to be set aside every 3 years and given to the poor. And these are the kinds of laws that put Israel on the cutting edge of justice in comparison to their ancient neighbors, and it was all bound up with their worship of God. The next section outlines the character qualities of Israel's leaders. So the elders, the priests, the kings, these were all placed under the authority of the covenant laws, which God said that he would enforce by sending prophets to keep the leaders accountable. So in contrast to Israel's neighbors, where kings were thought of as divine and a law unto themselves, Israel's leaders were subordinate to the law and the prophets. Following this is a large section of laws about Israel's civil life, so rules about marriage and family and business, and also about social justice, about their legal system and how it was to protect widows and orphans and immigrants. And then these are concluded by more laws about worship. Now, here's some tips for reading all of these laws. Remember, first of all, these are the terms of the Sinai covenant given specifically to ancient Israel, living in a culture that's very different from yours. And so, two, it's not going to be helpful to compare these laws with modern laws from a very different culture. Rather, these were given to set Israel apart. And so we need to compare these laws with those of Israel's neighbors, like in Assyria or Babylon. And when you do that, all of a sudden laws that seemed harsh or bizarre become much more clear. You see that God is pushing Israel to a higher level of justice than was ever known before. And so finally, try to discern what core principles of wisdom or justice underlie any particular law, and you'll discover some really profound things. So here's an extra credit assignment. Go see how Paul the Apostle does this very thing in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 9, and he quotes a law from Deuteronomy, chapter 25, verse 4. It's really interesting. So back to Moses. After he goes through all of the laws, he issues a final challenge that Israel should listen to and love their God. He first issues a warning and an ultimatum. If Israel listens to and obeys their God, everything's going to go great, lots of divine blessing. But if they don't listen and rebel, famine, plague, devastation, and ultimately exile from the land. And then Moses forces a decision. He says, "Today I set before you all life or death, blessing or curse, goodness or evil. So choose life by loving the Lord your God and listening to him." But then Moses prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel the hope for a new heart. So Moses ends his speech with a poem of warning and then of blessing, and then he walks up onto a mountain and he dies. And so the Torah draws to a close. All of the major plot tensions of the biblical story are in place, but left totally unresolved. So when is the descendant of the woman going to come and defeat evil? Or how is God going to rescue the whole world and bless all nations through this family? And how can God's holiness be reconciled with people who are continually rebellious? And how is God going to transform the hearts of his people? You just have to keep reading to find out. But for now, that's what the book of Deuteronomy is all about.
That's pretty cool, isn't it? I thought that was pretty cool. Like I say, you can get to this on the internet at thebibleproject.com, and you have to worm around a little bit to find it, but they've got tons of things like this. If you don't watch it, you'll find yourself spending all kinds of time watching these. I like these little summaries because they're pretty good. So anyway, great. So any thoughts about that before we start? Yeah, John, get your microphone there. Brad's got it. He's busy dealing with it.
I kind of didn't like the middle part.
Okay, tell me about it. What middle part?
Well, it said the ancient law, and it
Yes.
put a lot of emphasis
Yes.
on that ancient law.
I caught that too. The first time I saw it, I thought, I don't particularly like that part. It's kind of like they were preparing us to make the standard antinomial Christian excuse for, but this law doesn't apply to us. But they
Right.
didn't really say that.
No, I know, but
Yeah, but I didn't.
it said not. Well, it's hard for those to apply to our modern law because we're so sophisticated and progressive.
Yeah, right.
There's
And they
an
even went on
there's-
and said we really haven't progressed.
Right, but
But what it did say was it said, so you need to try to understand the principle. You need to try to understand what God was trying to do with these laws that,
Right.
that were for ancient
that's
times.
true.
But go ahead. I'm sure you had other things to say, didn't you?
No,
That's pretty much it. But I caught that
it's
too.
early.
Even though you speak of the ancient laws are the blueprint of all the other laws throughout the generations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So even though they're ancient in the fact that they had a beginning, what makes them ancient.
Well, and we've often talked about how some of the laws that we read about here in the Torah are stuff that's very fundamental and instrumental in our legal system today, right? So even though they may be ancient, they've got they've had a profound effect on what we call law today. Go ahead, Brad. You don't have anything? Okay, the thing about Deuteronomy, there's a couple of things that are kind of interesting. First of all, you talk about lack of action. There's not much action in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is essentially Moses' dialogue, his monologue. His monologue. This is his last hurrah. At the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses goes up and dies. Okay, so it's kind of interesting because this is these are his last words. Another thing that Dave brought up just this time that I hadn't thought about, but it's important, is he's saying all this to a group of people that hadn't heard it yet, or at least hadn't heard it. They hadn't been through it because this is the second generation, right? The first generation all died. So Moses is about 120 right now, and I'm sure he's tired, but he's trying to give them the benefit of what he's learned that they need to. Go ahead, Angela.
I thought it was unusual. Well, how did Moses know, maybe God told him, that they were, in essence, going to fail
Mm-hmm.
and end up in a not very good place,
Mm-hmm.
in exile? Even though it's the truth,
Mm-hmm.
it's not a very, locker room speech.
Yeah, as he said, kind of a downer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's
And
two things there.
How did he know?
Well, one thing is, as you said, I'm sure that God had told him that. But the other thing is he's been following and leading, actually. He's been leading these guys since before they left Egypt, right? And he knows them. He knows them. And they are, as God had described, a stiff-necked people. And we ourselves have said, how can they be so callous as to not have realized the import of this miraculous thing that happened to them just 2 weeks earlier, like the crossing of the Red Sea, some of that stuff, they do seem to be rather oblivious sometimes. So I think he also just kind of says, I know you guys are just, you numbskulls are just never going to figure this out, Joe?
Yeah, they didn't know, but I'm sure that the second generation had heard, maybe
They're a little better.
a little better of that there, but what they may not understood. But you remember that the disciples at Yeshua's time didn't understand either.
Yeah,
And
that's true too.
And I think today we don't understand.
No, we don't.
Yeah.
That's true.
This human nature.
Yeah. Well, there are some things, obviously, about God that we will never understand because we're not built in such a way that we can, right? We're stuck in time. He's not. Go ahead.
So just to have some commentary on what you asked, it's important to remember, of course, that Moses had a really close relationship with our father, so I'm sure he enlightened him. But also, as you were saying, like, that wasn't really a locker room kind of speech, but it's just the truth, you know, like we are decrepit, like we're really terrible people because we're born into sin. But once we accept Yeshua as our Savior, he transforms us. So he was just highlighting the inevitable, which I think is kind of amazing in a way. Like God always does that in the Word. He always gives revelations, you know, of what's going to happen. So just like how the video is showing, like it goes to the chapter in Ezekiel, chapter in Jeremiah about creating a new heart. So, I mean, in a sense, you could think it's kind of positive. It is positive because we have the promise of a new heart.
Mm-hmm.
So even though we're going to fail, you know, because of our sin, we can accept Yeshua as our Savior and be transformed. So there's hope.
It's more positive for the future and not so much for them, as you say. But it's for us. Another thing I was thinking of as you were talking is, you know, even when the Bible is just full of all the horrible predictions. I mean, we're going to see some here in Deuteronomy. One of my favorite places is he spends like about a paragraph and a half telling how great it's going to be if you're obedient to the Torah. And then he spends like 2.5 chapters telling how horrible it's going to be if you're not. Right? And so it's kind of like, well, gee whiz, that's a little out of balance. But he always ends it on the same positive note. And that positive note is, this will be okay if you'll just wake up and, you know, smell the roses, repent for what you've done. I'll always be there. But so it's always on a positive note. And that, I think, is an important thing, too. And another thing that, again, while you were talking, it's important, it's hard, but it's important for us to realize that, you know, the way they'd use it in the vernacular, God's in this for the long haul. This is the long game. Our lifetime is nothing compared to the thing he's trying to do. So, yeah, I mean, how do you suppose Moses felt when God told him, he says, well, you're not going to cross the Jordan River. You know, you're going to die here. I mean, I'm sure, well, we'll read some stuff where it indicated that Moses is still a little bitter about all of that, you know. But it's important that we understand that God knows what he's doing. And we can't all be alive to see the culmination, although we probably will be alive. It's just not this way. Okay, Joe.
Carrying this on another step, I think, and Yeshua said to the disciples when the question was answered, he said, "Have I been you so long? Have I been with you for so long, and you do not know?"
Yeah.
And so, the ancient Israel had to know some of the history, and by knowing, they purposely refused to listen to that history. History has a way of repeating itself.
Well, there's that.
You know,
Yeah.
so they weren't so naive. You know that.
Well, they were without excuse.
They were without excuse, as we are today.
As we are today. That's true. Okay. Let's go on and get started then. I like I say, I like to kind of show where we are. We're going to enjoy the book of Deuteronomy. It's really a good book. So who would like to start reading? We're going to read chapter 1 from just the first 8 verses of chapter 1. Okay, Margaret says she'll do it. Margaret's right here.
I'll do 8 verses.
Okay.
Deuteronomy, chapter 1. These are the words which Moses spake unto all Israel on this side Jordan, in the wilderness, in the plain opposite Suph, between Paran and Tophel and Laban and Hazeroth and Dizahab. There are 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir unto Kadesh Barnea. And it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spake unto the children of Israel, according unto all that Yahweh had given him in commandment unto them. And he had slain Sihon, the king of the Amorites, which dwelt in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, which dwelt at Ashtoroth in Edrei. On this side Jordan, in the land of Moab began Moses to declare this law, saying, Yahweh our Elohim spake unto us in Horeb, saying, You have dwelt long enough in this mount. Turn you, and take your journey, and go to the mount of the Amorites, and into all the places nigh thereunto, in the plain, in the hills, and in the vale, and in the south, and by the seaside, to the land of the Canaanites, and unto Lebanon, unto the great river, the river Euphrates. Behold, I have set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which Yahweh sware unto your fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give unto them and to their seed after them.
Okay, great, thank you. So the first question is, so when did these events happen? How long had they been wandering around in the desert, does it say?
40 years, 11 months.
Yep, it says this is the 40th year on the first day of the 11th month. So they've been wandering around 40 years. And then the where. There's a bunch of descriptions, and you know me and maps, I always like maps. This is one of the simpler maps. I remember they started over here and they came down by some path, and we decided that Midian is over here on the northwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula. And then I thought it was interesting, they talked about it's 11 days from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea. So Horeb is somewhere over in here. Horeb is another name for Mount Sinai. Okay, so it's down here somewhere, and Kadesh Barnea is up there. And you can, if Saudis would let you in, you could go find that mountain because they know where it is, and there's a chain link fence around it. But you could find this mountain, and certainly you could find Kadesh Barnea because I found it, and it's in present-day Israel. So, but it says if you're walking, it's 11 days to get from here to there. And then basically they have spent most of the last 40 years wandering around here. Okay? This is a different map, but it's got a little more to it. This doesn't show the south, but I'll show the south in a minute. Edom is one of the kingdoms over here. What do you know about Edom? Yeah, we got a question or two. Let's ask a question or two.
Just recently, there was news that Saudi Arabia opened a lot of that up for people to see.
Yep.
Is that true?
I don't
Remember
know, but that would sure be good. It would
I think
make
they do.
sense based on, the Jordanians have always been kind of jealous of all the tourist dollars that the Israelis got, and they've been trying to do some of that. So I can imagine the Saudis don't need the money, but they might want to do some of that too. Go ahead, do you have a question?
Well, I was sitting here and I was trying to think of what it might be like to be one of those people. You were born in the desert. That's all you've known your whole life is getting manna, right?
Yeah, it'd be like being born in Phoenix.
Yes.
Yeah,
But more than that, they couldn't exist without God.
Yep.
Every day.
Yep.
So their existence was very different from their parents' existence.
That's a very good point. We don't have record particularly of this generation saying, oh, I wish we still had the leeks and onions back in Egypt. Let's go back to Egypt where everything was better. They're not saying that.
They don't even know,
they don't know
what's
that.
in Egypt.
Yeah.
All they know is what. So it's almost as if, God pulled them out of the world,
Mm-hmm.
and that's all he knew. Like, my assumption is that there was no interaction with these other gods. They didn't even know about them. All they knew were the traditions and that, with God. So I would think that this
would be better.
generation,
Yeah.
yes, would just understand that connection with God.
Another thing that came to mind while you were talking about that is although God took the previous generation out of Egypt, he couldn't get Egypt out of them. So he had to wait. God had to wait for the next generation, because the next generation then could grow up without that influence and without that excuse of, oh, gee, I wish we were back in Egypt, because they did. That's a very good point. That's a good point. Or
Yeah, if you search, just go to a search engine, search Saudi Arabia opens biblical sites to Christian tourism. They just did this a couple months ago.
really?
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
There's a whole bunch of news articles about it.
Good. Thank you.
I'm sure there were a few old timers who were kids when they came out of Egypt, because the people who were under 20 didn't face the.
Yeah, if you were 18,
yeah.
you could have outlasted the whole thing. That's true.
So basically, the oldest person other than Moses, Joshua, and Caleb wouldn't have been over 60 years old. There'd been nobody over 60 other than those three. Yeah. Because I think Aaron was already died.
Aaron's dead.
And Miriam's also.
Dead. Yep.
And also, I was watching a thing about that guy who did those movies, evidence, patterns of evidence.
Yep.
And he wants to do like a whole series. One of them is going to Mount Sinai.
Mm-hmm.
And in this interview I was watching of him, I can't remember the guy's name, but he actually did go there at one time.
There are a couple
and
of
he
groups
took
that have done
he
that.
took a bunch of footage, but the Saudis took all his footage,
Yeah.
so he had nothing.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay, I was going to go over the maps a little bit more just for the fun of it here. Oops, let me go back over to this one. We have Edom. Edom, you remember? Let's see. Well, I don't know what else I wanted. I was just going to show you. This is the Sea of Galilee here, and here's the Dead Sea. Way up here to the north, Mount Hermon, here's Damascus. That's not a great map. This one's a little better here. Let's look at this one. Similar, but it shows some interesting things. For example, the plains of Moab is right here. This is at the northeast corner of the Dead Sea. These are the plains of Moab, and that's where the Israelites are now. That's where this is going on, and that's where they're going to be for this entire book. Okay? Now, there's nothing up there. This is bleak looking stuff. It's even worse than south of here. It's not pleasant looking. And all they have to do is march down here and cross that river, which is not much of a river. And right there is Jericho. And that's where the whole thing starts in the book of Joshua, starts there. So they're on the doorstep of their, future destiny. And the place where Moses is going to check out is up here, just above the plains of Moab, called Mount Nebo. I have some pictures of that. Shechem is up here. Dothan, there's Shechem right there. That's Shechem. So Shechem exists in the valley between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. Do you have another question like that? Yep, that's where they have Mount Ebal and Mount, yep, we're going to talk about that. What happened to that map I had? Somewhere I got out a map. I made Dave take it down. It's a relief map of this, and you can sit and look at it, and you can see the thing that's interesting to me is everything from about here all the way down here is below sea level. That thing. You ought to come up and look at that later because it's a topographical map, and it shows you how high and low things are. And another thing I wanted to point out is this area here from here all the way down south in the Jordan River Valley and south of the Dead Sea is called the Arabah. The Arabah means hot, desert, desolated. We'll talk about it here in a minute. Okay, let's see. I wanted to talk about Edom. Who settled Edom? Esau. This is settled by Esau, and Esau is Israel or Jacob's brother, right? And then we have Moab, and we have Ammon. I think it's very interesting that the capital of Jordan today is Ammon. Now, who are Moab and Ammon? Does anybody remember? They are the sons that Lot had by his daughters. Okay? So this is the land that they settled in and God gave to them, and this is the land that Ammon settled in. We've heard the term Gilead. Here's Gilead, here's Bashan. These are on the east side of the Jordan River. then let's see, I think there's one other map I wanted to show. Oh, I wanted to show what Mount Nebo looks like. Okay, this is Mount Nebo. And if you go up there, you can stand right in front of this little plaque here, and you can look and see what you're looking at out over there. And that's what you see. I mean, that's what it looks like. And it's got a one arrow that points up here. It says Nablus. Nablus is Shechem. Okay. There's Jericho. Can't read that. Oh, Ramallah. Jerusalem. Jerusalem is right over there somewhere. Then there's, I can't read that good enough, but I'm not sure what that is. Well, here, if I came over this way, I bet I could read it. Qumran, yeah, that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. There's Bethlehem, Herculon, or something like that. Then this is the Dead Sea, if you can't tell, out there. And finally, Hebron over here. And then it tells you how far it is to things. Like it's only 46 kilometers to Jerusalem. It's only 27 kilometers to Jericho. So things are close. I just wanted you to see. Again, it's important that you realize this stuff really exists, and you can go there. Matter of fact, the Jordanians would love to have you go there. And this is a kind of a viewpoint that they set out. This is the one that I was at, and this is a statue or sculpture, I guess. They called it the Brazen Serpent. It's modern, as you can tell by looking, but it's a kind of a tribute to both Moses and his brazen serpent on a staff, as well as to Yeshua. But that's what it looks like. That's what it looked like the day I looked out there. And the problem is it's oftentimes so hazy and dusty you really can't see. But if you look far enough over there, I'm convinced you could probably see the Mediterranean Sea.
Are the Jordanians Jewish or?
No. The Jordanians are Arab, but there are.
But they came from Lot. You're saying Lot's heritage?
Well, there's more than just today's Jordanians have got more people involved than just those. But that land is, yes, that land was
That's
settled
how it started.
Yep, by Moab and Ammon. But it's an Arab country. I think it's interesting that after the 1967 war, the Israelis signed peace accords with Egypt and Jordan. And that's a long time ago now. That's 50 years ago. And the Egyptians and the Israelis have been okay, friends, and the Egyptians and the Jordanians have been okay. That says something. The Syrians never did it, and the Syrians are still acting up. But anyway, I just wanted to show you all that. So let's go back. We'll look at the map in case we need to. See, what else do I want to ask question-wise? He talked about, in verse 3, this was the land after he defeated Sihon, the king of the Amorites. Let's see. Who reigned in Heshbon at Edrei and had defeated Og, the king of Bashan. So there's Bashan. One of these maps, I can't look very good. It has Edrei on it. These places are theoretically known on there. Okay. Verse 6, he says, you've been long enough here. This is Moses relating the story of when they left Mount Sinai. So that would have been 40 years ago almost, 39 anyway. God said to us at Mount Horeb, you have stayed long enough at this mountain, break camp and advance into the hill country of the Amorites and go to all the neighboring peoples in the Arabah, that's that word I was telling you about, in the mountains, in the western foothills, in the Negev. Negev is a desert that's, let's see. The Negev is primarily here. The Arabah is just this valley that goes from here to here. So the Negev is a Hebrew word that means desert because that's what's there, but it really means south. The south part of Egypt is desert. Anyway, along the coast, land of the Canaanites. Okay, and there's Lebanon. Lebanon, of course, is way up north. Any thoughts? Any questions about any of that stuff?
Is there any indication of how long it took them to take care of Basan and?
But yep. Now, do you remember we read about those? They occurred in the last few chapters of the book of Numbers. They're both talked about. We're going to talk more about that in a minute, but it didn't take long. And the reason, I'm glad you brought that. There's a couple of things. The reason they were sick, well, I shouldn't steal the thunder. We'll wait till we get there. Okay. There is one thing I did want to point out, though. It's real easy to gloss over the fact that the Ammonites and the Amorites are not the same thing. Okay? The Moabites are easy enough because their name's different, but the Moab and Ammon were the descendants of Lot. The Amorites is an entirely different thing. The Amorites are a group of people that had a particularly abhorrent pagan worship. I don't know what it was, but God didn't like the Amorites. They had, as a matter of fact, if you go back to Genesis chapter 15, when God is telling Moses that your descendants are going to be in a foreign land for 400 years and they're going to come out in the fourth generation. The reason for this, he says, back in that chapter, is because the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete. So the Amorites became irredeemable. So I just want you to keep in mind when you see Amorites, make sure you think different because they're not descendants of Ammon necessarily. They're a culture that is not specific to a location. It was all over Canaan. Anything else? Okay. Any other thoughts? You want to move on? Someone like to read from chapter 1, verse 9 through 19, just another 10 verses. We'll talk about that. 10 verses is easy. We got to help her over. Well, if you got someone else, you go ahead. We'll save you. Okay?
And I spoke to you at that time, saying, I shall not be able by myself to bear you. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, ye are today as the stars of heaven for multitude. The Lord God of your fathers add to you 1,000-fold more than you are, and bless you as he has spoken to you. How shall I alone be able to bear your labor, and your burden, and your gainsayings? Take to yourselves wise and understanding and prudent men for your tribes, and I will set your leaders over you. And ye answered me and said, the thing which thou hast told us is good to do. So I took of you wise and understanding and prudent men, and I set them to rule over you as rulers of thousands and rulers of hundreds and rulers of 50s and rulers of 10s and officers to your judges. And I charged your judges at that time, saying, hear causes between your brethren, and judge rightly between a man and his brother, and the stranger that is with him. Thou shalt not have respect to persons in judgment. Thou shalt judge small and great equally. Thou shalt not shrink from before the person of a man, for the judgment is God's. And whatsoever matter shall be too hard for you, ye shall bring it to me, and I will hear it. And I charged you at that time all the commands which ye shall perform.
Okay.
Right there.
Yep, that's fine. Now, did anybody tell me about the event that's described here? Did anybody come to Shabbat last Shabbat? So what name should come to your head when you read this, Margaret?
Jethro.
Jethro.
To
Moses. Yeah, Jethro giving counsel to Moses. Yep. That delegate is another word. He said, in my version, in verse 9 says, at that time I said to you, you are too heavy a burden for me to carry alone. Okay, and that's what Jethro observed. It says everybody, all these millions of people were standing around waiting for Moses to pronounce, yes, you should do this, and no, you shouldn't do that, and all this kind of stuff. And it really wasn't a very good way to do things. And so Jethro suggested this, And this is what they did. Yeah, Joe?
You got to give Moses credit for realizing his limitations in leading the people. And I'm sure that when God told him how to pick the men, that's quite different what they do today, where somebody's well-to-do or something like that, they were picked. But God knew, and he had to know that these men that were being picked were for God, you know. But Moses, he knew his limitations, which I give him credit for.
Sure, that's fine. Mike's got something.
Doesn't it seem like Moses is taking credit for something that Jethro advised him to do?
Yep. There's several places where we're going to see Moses kind of puts his own spin on things, but I think that's an important thing to look at, because there's one in particular we're going to come to here in a few minutes, and that's when they sent out the spies. Because I've often been reflected on the fact that the way that story comes across in Deuteronomy is a little bit different than the way it comes across in Numbers. The effects are the same, and everything's really the same, but it makes you kind of sit there and think the truth was probably somewhere in the middle there. And God does that. I mean, there's a reason. I remember the first time I read the Gospels, sat down to read the New Testament, and I was reading the book of Mark, and I thought, gee whiz, I just read this, and it, big light bulb goes on. All four of those books are the same. They're all talking about the same thing. What's going on here? And it's because if you look at the same thing from 3 or 4 different directions, you get kind of a different idea of what's going on. And I think some of this is that way too. So yes, it looks like it was Moses' idea or God's idea, when the truth of the matter is the guy that suggested it was Jethro. But Jethro said, if you remember back to last Shabbat, Jethro said, if this seems like a good idea to you and to your God, then I would suggest you do this. John?
Are you going to talk about 17 at all?
17.
Verse 17.
No, we can. Why don't you speak about that?
Well, after he does all this, saying, I gathered all these judges together and do all that, one of the first things he says is, and I'll just read 17, you shall not respect persons in judgment, but you shall hear the small as well as the great. Persons, I'm assuming.
Yep.
You shall not be afraid of the face of man, for the judgment is God's. And the case that is too hard for you, bring it unto me, and I will hear it.
Yep.
So, in the instruction, so in the Declaration of Independence, it says those famous words, in the beginning.
In the beginning.
That's another famous book.
Uh-huh.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, meaning this.
Meaning this.
No respecter of persons. You don't get to say if you have more money or less money, you can, we'll let things slide or something.
Yep. I thought one of the things, that little thing from the Bible Project pointed out, was the importance of God's justice. If there's one thing that I think we've been cheated on in the Christian church, is that they've made God out to be all love. But he's got two sides, and both sides are equal in that one is loving and merciful, but the other is just. And justice, as it says, as you said, is no respecter of persons. And that comes real clear in the Torah.
So I'm back to being one of the people, and I'm thinking, okay, these people came from the desert. They were given their food. They did have some animals, right? Okay, but now they're going to cross over and they're going to start their lives. Kind of like, when the people came to America, in a way. How did they? So I relate this to if all electricity stopped, would I know how to make butter? Would I know how to milk a cow?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that these people never grew up knowing how to do, like how to plant seed. And
go on.
I'm just wondering, go and do this. And I'm like, okay, how did they, because they're killing everybody along the way, so they're not learning from the people. how did they
Well,
learn these
okay.
things?
There, I'll give you 2 or 3 thoughts with what you've said. Certainly, I mean, they're not killing everybody, but that's the way it appears. They certainly killed plenty of them, but I'm sure there were, and if we go through Joshua and some of that stuff, there are plenty of them that didn't die. Secondly, the whole state of society was much lower back then. I mean, these people knew how to raise animals, and they probably knew how to grow stuff. I mean, I tell you what you say about that is much more reflective of the position we are in today than where they were. Their distance from how to take care of themselves was not near as big as our distance of how to take care of ourselves, if you ask me. So I think they could probably figure out. I mean, there'd be some learning, there'd be some mistakes, but also God has said He'd be with them. So if you screw up and plant your corn wrong, I'll make it grow anyway, kind of a thing, So, but you're right. They had a lot to learn. On the other hand, you figure they're out there wandering around the desert somewhat aimlessly all their lives, if you will. They got to be excited. I mean, gee whiz, if nothing else, it's something different, So, but I think it's good to put yourself in their position sometimes and think about that stuff. Joe, did you have something? You almost always have something.
Yeah, thank you. And what John was saying about verse 17, where no respect of persons, that in the New Testament talks about a man coming in and he's dressed in fine linen, is very rich. He gets the choice seat.
Mm-hmm.
And then the person there. And then I was also thinking along with that God, man looketh on the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart.
Yep, that's true. But
I just want to point out that when they went into the land and ejected the inhabitants, they took over a massive amount of infrastructure.
Yep.
There were fields already prepared.
Yep.
Wells, storage facilities, buildings.
Yep.
Pastures, irrigation systems.
Yep.
I mean,
houses. Yep. You're right.
They were working very hard for 400 years when they're supposed to repent, and they didn't. So then they lost all the stuff they had worked on.
Yep. You're exactly right.
And the other thing I want to point out in verse 17, when it's talking about the judges, I've seen some commentaries refer back to these type of verses saying that when these judges were set up, they became Elohim, they became gods, which I don't see that anywhere.
I don't either.
It's not in the text.
Yeah.
Some of these commentaries tend to sometimes make up stories.
Yep. That's again, relating to that thing we saw from the Bible Project. They went to a little effort to contrast the society that God has in mind versus the society that man ended up developing, in which case those kings ruled by what they called divine right. What they said went, they were the law. And God says, no, that's not the way you should operate. The law sits over here and it's written down, and I'll tell you what it says, but you can read it for yourself. So yeah, you're right. Margaret had something.
I was just going to say that they still had the herds.
Yes,
that
yes, they
to,
were sheep shepherds.
to need to. And I've always wondered, and I happen to think that the herds were probably eating the manna also,
Oh, that's a
or
thought.
grazing on the manna.
I had never thought about
Because
that.
I mean,
They just got to lick it up.
if it was as desolate as some of the places are, I know when I was in Israel, you see these goats going in these little paths and there's nothing.
Mark Twain has said they ate rocks because
Yeah,
that's all
what
there
do
was
they
for them
eat?
to eat.
You wonder,
Yeah.
what are they eating? So I'm thinking all these flocks, they must have had quite a few flocks when they left. So I guess they would have had milk and cheese
Mhm.
in addition to the manna.
Yeah, they were probably more into ranching than farming.
Yeah. Yeah, but they, I don't know, maybe they gathered wild stuff like,
I'm sure. Some of them probably even tried tilapia farming. Okay, let's see. Does somebody want to go on? We'll read from verse 19 through 25. 19 through 25. That's a short little one. Let's see. Great.
Verse 19. Then we set out from Horeb and went through all that great and awesome wilderness which you saw on the way to the mountains of the Amorites, as Yahweh our Elohim had commanded us, and we came to Kadesh Barnea. And I said to you, you have come to the mountains of the Amorites, which Yahweh our Elohim has given us. See, Yahweh our Elohim has set the land before you. Go up and possess it, as Yahweh Elohim of your fathers has spoken to you. Do not fear nor be discouraged. And all of you came near to me and said, let us send men before us, and let them search out the land for us, and bring back word to us of the way by which we should go up, and of the cities into which we would come. And the matter was good in my eyes, so I took 12 of your men, 1 man from each tribe. And they turned and went up into the mountains and came to the Wadi Eshcol and spied it out.
One more verse.
One more. And they took some of the fruit of the land in their hands and brought it down to us. And they brought back word to us, saying, the land which Yahweh our Elohim has given us is good.
Okay. All right. Now, it's clear what event they're talking about here, right? Now, if you wanted to go and read about this event, the first, as it happened, this is Moses telling it, right? This is Moses describing it. And as a matter of fact, he's describing it to a lot of people who were either very young or not even alive at the time it happened. So he's describing it, and it's described a little bit differently than the way it's told in what book? Numbers. It's in Numbers, right? So if you go read it in Numbers, one of the things that's different is this verse 23 says, the idea seemed good to me, so I selected people. In verse 22 it says, the people came to me and said, let us send men ahead to spy out the land. It's not like one is specifically different than the other. It's just that when you read the event in Numbers, it kind of makes you feel like this was God's idea. And when you read it here, it kind of appears it wasn't God's idea. I just thought I'd point that out. You can go back and make a search of that and see what you think. But is this an accurate portrayal of what essentially happened? He took a leader from each tribe, he sent them out, and they came back, and they brought samples of the food, and they said, the land is good. Not much goes on there. So, it mentions the Amorites. So it talks about how they left Horeb and went up to Kadesh Barnea, and in so doing, they went through the land of the Amorites. So the Amorites certainly were here, and like I say, they're also up in here. The Amorites and the Midianites were two groups of people that Yahweh had a hard time with. Certainly the Amorites were the ones that were mentioned in Genesis 15 that talked about their sin is not yet complete. Any other thoughts? You want to move on? You want to read verse 26 through the end of the chapter? I'll read that. Starting in verse 26. But you were unwilling to go up. You rebelled against the command of Yahweh your God. You grumbled in your tents and said, Yahweh hates us, so he brought us out of Egypt to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us. Where can we go? Our brothers have made us lose heart. They say, the people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large, with walls up to the sky. We even saw the Anakites there. And then I said to you, do not be terrified. Do not be afraid of them. Yahweh your God, who is going before you, will fight for you, as he did for you in Egypt, before your very eyes, and in the desert. There you saw how Yahweh carried you as a father carries his son, all the way you went until you reached this place. In spite of this, you did not trust Yahweh your God, who went ahead of you on your journey in fire by night and in a cloud by day, to search out places for you to camp and to show you the way you should go. When Yahweh heard what you said, he was very angry, and he solemnly swore, not a man of this evil generation shall see the good land I swore to give to your forefathers, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. He will see it, and I will give him and his descendants the land he set his feet on, because he followed Yahweh wholeheartedly. Because of you, Yahweh became angry with me also and said, you shall not enter it either, but your assistant Joshua, the son of Nun, will enter it. Encourage him, because he will lead Israel to inherit it. And the little ones that you said would be taken captive, your children who did not yet know good from bad, they will enter the land. I will give it to them, and they will take possession of it. But as for you, turn around and set out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea. And then you replied, we have sinned against Yahweh. We will go up and fight as Yahweh our God commanded us. And so every one of you put on his weapons, thinking it was easy to go up into the hill country. But Yahweh said to me, tell them, do not go up and fight, because I will not be with you. You will be defeated by your enemies. So I told you, but you would not listen. You rebelled against Yahweh's command, and in your arrogance you marched up into the hill country. The Amorites who lived in those hills came out against you, and they chased you like a swarm of bees and beat you down from Seir all the way to Hormah. And you came back and wept before Yahweh, but he paid no attention to your weeping, and turned a deaf ear to you. And so you stayed in Kadesh many days, all the time you spent there. So this is Moses telling of the result of the spies. It's a little bit different, isn't it? So what are some of the ways that this story looks a little bit different than the one we read in, where would we read about that? Numbers, right? We'd read about that, Numbers. Joe's got something.
The spies that went out, only 2 came back, and they had the faith.
No, all 12 of them came back.
Yeah, but the 2 of them were more positive in their what they were doing
But that says
than
that.
with these others.
Yeah. Somebody else had their hand up. Oh, it's John. By the way, if you wanted to go look at that original one, I think it's in Numbers 13.
If I remember correctly, the ones in Numbers 13 are all people that didn't exist or weren't written about before. They weren't leaders from mentioned in previous times.
No, their names were all new to us.
Right. So I thought he was kind of embellishing it here and making it sound like, it was your fault when I'm the one that I assumed had picked them, but it sounds like they picked them for not good reasons.
That could be. I thought one of the interesting things was he blamed them for the fact he couldn't go. Right? Well, let me read it to you. He says here, verse 37, because of you, Yahweh became angry with me also and said, you shall not enter it either, but your assistant Joshua, son of Nun, will enter it. So Moses is saying, this is your fault. I don't get to go across the Jordan, and you guys did it to me. John?
All those guys are dead. Who's he talking to?
I think it's sour grapes. He's just mad. I mean,
He's
he said, well, I'll tell you what, it ties back into that comment he made earlier about, you guys are too heavy for me. This is too much for me. I mean, you remember the scene with the rock, when he beat on the rock rather than speaking
That's why
to
he
it?
couldn't go in.
Yeah, but what did he say?
You rabble
You
rousers.
rebels, must I provide water for you? And whacked on the rock, right?
Wasn't that incident later, though? It wasn't at this same time.
Yes, it was.
Was it?
Yeah.
When he struck the rock?
I think, well, it was certainly near this time.
Oh.
It may not have been exactly this time, but you can go figure that out. You have one?
When I read through this, because that kind of, he's talking like present tense, but it's a historical recounting of
Yes.
what happened, and
Yep.
he's telling it. I don't know what person you say he's talking in, but anyway, he's just recounting what happened, saying you and all that.
Yeah.
But not really.
You're right. Not really speaking to the right people. I tell you a thought that just happened to be. Sometimes my old dad is getting pretty old, and if we sit around and talk and bring up some story, the way he tells the stories these days is quite a bit different than the way I remember them happening, you know? But they certainly come out to be more humorous the way he tells them. And the things that are learned tend to be emphasized. Yeah.
Well, Moses had its limitations, knowing that, but he also had a temper.
He didn't have
Because-
much of a temper,
yeah,
but he did.
Because he killed an Egyptian in Egypt.
Sure.
And then he blows off the handle and strikes the rock.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other side of his personality.
Well,
he had a temper.
I tell you what, I would hate to try to come anywhere close to his. I mean, you think he's got one? Look at me, you know. Yeah. Shut up, Dave. So anyway, any other thoughts about the way Moses tells his remembering of the story? John, do you have something else? Or? Okay, Numbers 20. Thank you. Margaret?
I think here, verse 21 is it's saying here where the fear not. We find that in the New Testament. We find that a lot
All
of
the
times.
time,
The fear
yes.
not. Verse 21, fear not, neither be discouraged. It seems like, yeah, they had a little trepidation going in there.
Sure.
You know, it wasn't like they were just, just wholeheartedly going in there. But I think that pretty much, the way he started this dissertation of recounting all the stories that they've gone through
Mm-hmm.
is that, don't be fearful. You got Yahweh with you. Don't,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's, I think, through the New Testament. Fear not.
Yep. Fear not. It's a very
Yeah,
common thing. God
Yahweh's,
says that a lot.
Yahweh's with you.
Yeah.
What could they do to you?
Yeah.
Kill you?
Yeah.
He can give you life back.
Okay. That's a
Yeah.
good point. Yep. Okay. We could go on a little bit. That's the end of chapter 1. Pretty good. Moving right along. Let's see. Well, Numbers, if we start Numbers chapter 2, there's several things that are going to be interesting in there, and that'll probably get us pretty much where we want to be. Let's see. Let's just read the first 8 verses. We'll take a little at a time. Yeah, I'm sorry, Pat.
I just think it's important maybe that we emphasize, since so many other opinions come up, including Moses' himself, was the people's fault. Because in verse 12 of 20 it says, "And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, saying, Because ye believed me not, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them."
Yeah.
Because even last Sabbath, I was hearing somebody say the reason that he didn't get to go in is because he got angry, and anger is sin. Well, Yeshua got angry, and God gets angry, so
Yeah.
be angry and sin not. But the emphasis is not the people's fault. It was his fault because he didn't
Yeah.
believe God enough in the first place, and secondly, he didn't sanctify Yahweh
No,
before.
you're exactly right. As a matter of fact, I might have been misleading about what I said. All I was saying is because the people were so difficult to deal with, Moses had reached the end of his tether probably more than once. And as you point out, being angry is one thing, but then whenever you decide to be angry and you mess around and disrespect God, that's the step too far. You're right. That's what God was angry about. But all I was saying is that Moses being a human being, I wouldn't fault him for being, for saying, well, it's you guys that did that. If you hadn't made me so darn mad by being so rebellious, I wouldn't have done it in the first place. But that's a little flaky. That excuse wouldn't have worked for God. There you go. It started in the Garden of Eden. Yep. Okay, someone want to read chapter 2, just the first 9 verses, and we'll talk about that for a minute.
And we turned and took our journey into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea, as Jehovah spake unto me. And we compassed Mount Sinai many days. And Jehovah spake unto me, saying, Ye have compassed this mount long enough. Turn you northward, and command thou the people, saying, Yes, you are to pass through the coast of your brethren, the children of Esau, which dwell in Seir. And they shall be afraid of you. Take ye good heed unto yourselves, therefore. Meddle not with them, for I will not give you of their land, no, not so much as a foot breadth, because I have given Mount Seir unto Esau for a possession. You shall buy meat of them for money, that you may eat, and ye shall also buy water of them for money, that you may drink. For Jehovah thy Elohim hath blessed them and all the works of thy hand. He knoweth thy walking through his great wilderness, thus these 40 years, that Jehovah thy Elohim hath been with thee. Thou hast lacked nothing. And when we passed by from our brethren, the children of Esau, which dwelt in Seir, through the way of the plain from Elat and from Ezen-Geber, we turned and passed by the way of the wilderness of Moab.
Okay, that's good enough for now. And we'll talk about what's going on there. Let's see. I think another map here. Maybe, nope. Well, I'm going to have to use this one. So here's Etzion-Geber. Now, this area, I've talked about this before. Etzion-Geber today is known as Aqaba. And we lived in Aqaba for a while. You could look out my window and you look across this little bit of blue land, or blue Red Sea, blue Red Sea, and you can see Elat, and it mentions Elat here. So Elat and Etzion-Geber. It said, what this describes, it says you were sitting around down there at Mount Horeb, and how long did it take them to build the tabernacle? About a year. And then he says, you've been, verse 3, you've made your way around this hill country long enough now. Turn north and give the people these orders. You are about to pass through territory of your brothers, of the descendants of Esau, who live in Seir. Now, Seir is commonly thought of as Petra. Here's Petra. So Edom is here just kind of south and east of the Dead Sea. So they've been wandering around here for 40 years, if you will, around in this area. So he says, okay, it's time to get going. So go to Edom and see if those guys will let you go through, right? Now, do you remember the story? Does anybody remember what happened to him? John?
So the way the story is told here, it's saying if they give you money or something to that effect, because they didn't want to deal. They didn't let them want. Esau says, "You are not going through our land."
Yeah,
they were very adamant about it.
Yep.
They brought their forces up. They didn't attack.
Yep.
But they came to the land and says, "No, you ain't coming through."
Yep.
And so I don't know. This is like he's saying. Well, this was the instructions to them to say. And it specifically says you're not to take 1 foot of their land.
Yeah. It says you're not to take 1 foot of their land, and if you go through it, you're to pay them for whatever you eat and whatever you drink.
So they had that option, but Esau put the kibosh on it.
The Edomites said no.
Completely different sidebar.
Mm-hmm.
Seir is where Mount Sinai is. No?
No. Seir is where Petra is. It's where Mount Hor is.
Well, Elat, they're talking about Elat.
Elat's here.
Yeah, I know.
Elat's here. Mount Sinai is down here.
So were they talking about going around the mountain, though? Or
well, the way it starts is you've been running around this country long enough. That's basically, I thought, it's basically Mount Sinai. It says go north. So he's basically saying, okay, come up and go north.
I guess I'm getting to is that describes better where we really think Mount Sinai is versus way down here at the bottom of the peninsula of Sinai.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe I'm
I agree. I think, to me, there's obviously controversy, and you're going to run into people that have a lot of different opinions about it. But I think anybody that looks into it very much concludes that it's not here. And the reasons for having it there are not very good. Right? It's that Constantine's mother or something Yeah, tradition. Yeah.
I got two things. My translation here says they circled Mount Seir for many days.
Okay.
Is that the same as Mount Horeb, which is the same
No,
as?
Seir's different. Seir, Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai are essentially the same place.
Okay.
Now you can get people that'll say there's a distinction between the two, but they're close enough together to be considered the same thing. But they're 11 days at least away from Mount Seir. Mount Seir is up here near Petra. Another way to put it, Mount Horeb and Sinai is in Saudi Arabia. Seir and Petra are in Jordan. Not that matters. There's a big border here between Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Huh? Yes, from there. Well, yeah. Yeah, that's right.
The second question I had, what are they using for money?
Money?
Yeah.
Well, now that's a good question. I've often wondered, when Abraham ran into Eleazar, you remember? And Eleazar was a runaway slave. And his owner had sent some of his men out to get him. And his men caught up with Abraham, says that slave belongs to someone else. We got to take him back. And Abraham bought him. So Abraham had a little bag of silver, evidently, and he had money. So I guess my point is, well, two things. First of all, they had money. They carried it with them, I'm sure. Second of all, you remember when they left Egypt, God made all the Egyptians predisposed to give them stuff. So they left with a fair amount of money. Sure. They can trade anything. Yeah. We'll probably have to get used to that again, too. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's see. So, anyway, I was interested in the fact that God had said, okay, you've spent 40 years wandering around here. It's time to go. All right? Now, the way to go is right up here, right? But they didn't go that way. It says to go see if your cousin Edom will let you go through his land. And although it doesn't say so here, we know that the Edomite says, no, you ain't coming through here. Right? And so what they had to do then, and it mentions it here, it said, make sure I get this right. So we went on past let's see, the Lord, God blessed you, all the work of your hands, watched over your journey 40 years. So we went on past our brothers, the descendants of Esau who live in Seir. We turned from the Arabah road, which comes up from Elat Netzion Geber, and traveled along the desert road of Moab. Okay? So they wanted here's the Arabah. It's that valley right there. And so they wanted to go right up this road here. Man, I've been up that road. That's kind of a cool road, right along the edge of the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is so interesting looking. It's this really, deep, not deep, kind of a light blue color, but it's very cool. There's I don't guess I'll go too far, but I drove this road here many, many times up to Amman. But anyway, couldn't drive that road, had to drive another road, which goes out to the east a little bit and up here, up by Moab. And that road climbs this great, huge hill to get you up on this plateau. If you stay in the Arabah, you don't climb any hills until you get up here, and then you go. So it's a much different road. But anyway, that's what that's saying. All right? We got a little bit more. We'll get on a real interesting topic, and then we'll quit. That'll be fun. Somebody want to read from verse 9 through, let's see, 9 through 23. Okay. Like I say, this will clearly take us to the end of the time. 23. 9 through 23.
And the Lord said unto me, distrust not the Moabites, neither contend with them in battle, for I will not give thee of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar unto the children of Lot for a possession. The Amims dwelt therein in times past, a people great and many and tall, as the Anakims, which also were accounted giants, as the Anakims, but the Moabites call them Emims. The Horems also dwelt in Seir before time, but the children of Esau succeeded them, and they had destroyed them from before them, and dwelt in their stead, as Israel did, unto the land of his possession, which the Lord gave unto him. Now rise up, said I, and get you over to the brook Zered. And we went over the brook Zered, and the space in which we came from Kadesh Barnea until we were come over the brook Zered was 38 years. That's a long time. Until all the generation of the men of war were wasted out from among the lost, as the Lord sware unto them. For indeed the hand of the Lord was against them, to destroy them from among the host until they were consumed. So it came to pass, when all the men of war were consumed, the dead from among the people, that the Lord spake unto me, saying, Thou art to pass over through the coast of Moab this day. And when thou comest nigh over against the children of Ammon, distress them not, nor meddle with them. For I will not give thee of the land of the children of Ammon any possession, because I have given it unto the children of Lot for a possession. That also was accounted a land of giants. Giants dwelt therein in old time. And the Ammonites called them
Zamzumites.
Zamzuzims. And a people great and many and tall. And the Anakims, but the Lord destroyed them before them, and they succeeded them and dwelt in their stead, as he did to the children of Esau, which dwelt in Seir, when he destroyed the Horems from before them. And they succeeded them and dwelt in their stead, even unto this day.
23, did you read 23?
And the Avims, which dwelt in Hazarim, even unto Azah, the Caphtorims, which came forth out of Caphtor, destroyed them and dwelt in their.
Okay, there's a lot of really interesting things here. Kenny's got something.
So in verse 10, the Amim,
Emites.
yeah, the Hebrew is Amim. But they were, for their name, what it means was the terrors.
The terrors, okay.
And when it says giants, the short form is Rapha, but they have Raphaim and giants in there with the name on it. But clearly they were giants, which begs the question on the whole, well, I guess I shouldn't go there.
No, we're going to go there, but
okay,
we're probably not going to go in great depth.
For sure.
Mhm.
There's, evidence of that, whether it was an occultic deal to bring forth these giants or a second incursion. I'm curious the opinions of everyone.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. I think because we're kind of at a beginning level, we probably won't go too deep, but there's some interesting things to talk about with respect to that. We'll get there in just a minute because it's important.
Which I think that this is clearly like the evidence of why they were completely purged was from the unredeemable aspect of them.
Yep.
Which had to do with some type of genetic impurity, not just the occultic impurities that they had brought forward.
That could be, but yeah,
So,
it's got to do with fallen angels.
Yep, fallen angels, absolutely. And it ties to the Genesis 6 narrative of and also after.
Yep, we're going to talk about that.
It's also interesting that when Israel, that was part of their mission, was to destroy these people.
Yep.
Because these giants were irredeemable people. But I do find it interesting that Yahweh actually used the Edomites too to displace these
Yes.
people, because
Yes.
it says he gave that land to them
Yep.
as an inheritance,
Yep.
which kind of tells me, his he isn't completely given up on these people, the Edomites.
No.
And he kept his promise to them too, to give them,
Oh, yeah.
to make them a great nation.
Yep.
And give them this land. And it kind of leads me to believe that it was himself who, as he led Israel to defeat a lot of their enemies, that he did that for Edom also.
Yep. I agree.
In this regard.
Yep. We'll talk about that in just a second. John's got something.
That's a very interesting point, because, and it wasn't about the descent. I would argue it wasn't about the descendants of Esau. It was Esau himself.
Mhm.
Remember when we hear about Esau and he confronts and they have this big confrontation
Yep.
with him and Jacob?
Yep.
Who's he got with him?
400 men.
So he's well on his way. One could argue he's well on the way of doing what God said was displace these guys.
Well, I'll tell you what, I can go you one better.
Ooh, good.
Good. If you go back to Genesis, there's a section in Genesis that talks about where Edom settled, and it lists all the chiefs of Edom, all the chiefs and the princes and all this kind of stuff. And it says the Edomites displaced the Horites, the very ones it says here. The Horites were the people that were residing in Petra, in Mount Seir, when Abraham gave it to, was Abraham? Isaac. When Isaac gave it to Esau. Isaac gave it to Esau and said, here's the land that you have. You might find a bunch of Horites over there. Go kick them out, but that's your land.
So many people like to beat up on the Edomites. Now, the Amalekites are a different story.
Amalekites are different. Yeah.
But, when you're doing your job and you're not doing your job, that's not good. So
the Edomites,
give credit where credit is due,
Yeah.
and look reflexive into yourself and say, am I really doing all the things that I should be doing?
Yeah. The Edomites, as you say, they're Jacob's brothers. Now, you could certainly argue that the, distance, with distance in quotes, between Esau and Jacob is not as much as the distance between Jacob and Moab and Ammon. Now, Moab and Ammon are sons of Lot, which is 2 generations earlier. But the point is God knows about all of them, and all of them we can follow through the whole Torah, and we know where they came from and how they got there.
The two of them shared a womb together for 9 months.
They were womb mates. All right. But anyway, there's 2 things I want to point out. I want to ask, first of all, my Bible, verses 10 through 12 are in parentheses. Does anybody else have verses 10 through 12 in parentheses? Okay. And also verses 20 through 23 are in parentheses. Okay. That doesn't mean anything other than that there's something special about them. I think what it means is they might have been added a little bit later. But they open up a whole bunch of doors, as Kenny had suggested, that also tie into Genesis chapter 6. And so we'll talk about that next time and kind of see what we think about that and where we can go with it, because I'm only just now beginning to kind of give this some credence, because it's hard sometimes to unlearn things that you've learned for a long time. So we'll talk about it. And I'm not asking that you necessarily agree, but we'll talk about it. No, yes, I take that back. What is it? The book of Enoch talks about these guys. Yes. division of labor. That's good the way you delegated that.
Next week, would it be all right if I put together some quotes in the opening from Enoch and Yochalim?
Yeah, yeah. I'll want to do a little preamble, but that's okay.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I'll get here early and
Okay.
because there's a potential evidence of part of why the Canaanites are being displaced because they didn't take the land allotted to them in the first place. But I'll get into
Okay.
the details.
Well, I don't want to get too far into it because
No.
it's been a bridge that's not been real easy for me to cross.
For sure.
Yeah.
We'll review it beforehand then.
Okay, that sounds fine. All right, let's. If there are any closing comments, that's fine. Otherwise, I'll close in prayer. Father God, thank you for the evening. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the fun of the book of Deuteronomy. Thank you for where it leads us. I just ask that you'd help us think on these things this coming week and help people get motivated and go kind of do some research on their own, Father God, and just give us an illuminating but yet truthful and helpful discussion next week about these things. And I just thank you again for your word. I thank you for the privilege of being able to study it together with a bunch of interested students. Keep us safe till next week. In Yeshua's name, amen. All right, you guys, thanks a lot, and good night.